My guest at this time is Andrew C. McCarthy. He's the former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. He's the author most recently of Ball of Collusion. He's a Fox News contributor and a contributing editor and columnist at National Review Online. And Andy, let's talk about the Inspector General's report from the Justice Department that came out on Monday after about a year and a half. We've been waiting for months now. We've constantly been told it's just about ready. It's just about ready. And finally, on Monday, December 9th, it came out. The conclusions: no political bias in the pursuit of a FISA warrant on Carter Page and no referrals for criminal prosecution. Have folks like Jim Comey and others taking a victory lap here, saying, we told you so. It was just good people doing their jobs. The president and his allies see it as a pretty damning indictment of just about everyone involved with the Carter Page situation and the FISA surveillance requests at the FBI. So what's your big takeaway here?
Well, I think that the FISA abuse is shocking. And if I were Horowitz, I think I would have, the IG, I would have stayed away from the question of predication of the investigation, because he really didn't exonerate them the way the media predictably picked that up and ran with it. What he basically says, Greg, is two things. One is the standard for opening an investigation in the FBI is so low. I mean, for a preliminary investigation, as he points out, there's no legal standard at all. They have a prudential standard that, you have to have basically a hunch in order to open an investigation. But because you basically, he's defined out of existence the idea that there's any quantum of evidence that's involved before you responsibly open an investigation. And then beyond that, he says, now I want you to understand right at the very beginning, I'm not here to second guess anybody's discretionary judgment calls. The only thing I'm here for is to tell you whether anyone violated a law or regulation. If you put those two things together, basically he's saying, I'm not here to second guess whether it was a good idea to open this investigation, whether it was appropriate, whether it was prudent, whether it violated an American norm against investigative interference in our electoral politics. That's not my job. The only thing I'm here to do is tell you whether they should have opened an investigation, and I can tell you they basically have no limitations on what they can investigate, so therefore it was okay. Now, that to me is not something that's worthy of taking a victory lap over, and in the meantime, the meat of the investigation, which is the only thing that he was really in a position to render judgment on, because there's a lot that has to do with predicating the investigation that is outside of Horowitz's bailiwick. He's limited to looking at Justice Department witnesses, whereas John Durham, the U.S. attorney who's doing a broader investigation to the origins of the Trump-Russia probe, can look at anything, including the intelligence community. So if I were Horowitz, I think I would have taken a pass on the predication part just because his information isn't comprehensive. And I would have stuck to what I could deal with, which was the presentation made by the Justice Department and the FBI to the FISA court, which was appalling. And I must say, the most appalling thing, you could itemize the 17 or 18 things that he cataloged, but I would give you two things, Greg. One, the investigation throughout continued to yield exculpatory information. In other words, they had this theory of Trump-Russia criminal collusion that didn't pan out, and it was clear that it wasn't going to pan out probably before they even filed the first warrant or sought the first warrant in the FISA court. And even as the case got worse in the sense of they're getting all this information back that there's no conspiracy, they continue the investigation 9 months into the Trump administration, which is just astonishing to me. And the second thing is they decide not to give Trump a defensive briefing. And that's a big element of the report. But I think there's a piece that's been missing in a lot of the coverage. I think it's fair enough to say, and I've certainly said this myself enough times, that there was no good reason for them not to give the Trump campaign a heads up if they were really worried that the Russians were using people who were attendant to the campaign as assets. My theory has always been, by the way, that what they were really convinced themselves of was that Trump was the asset. And if you draw that conclusion, everything they did make perfect sense. But what they're telling us is what they were really worried about are people like Page and Papadopoulos, and they elected not to give the campaign a briefing about those two guys because they didn't want them to find out about the investigation, and then they would have lost their ability to continue the probe. So they elevated the need to investigate Carter Page and George Papadopoulos over the need to inform someone who's running to be president of the United States that there might be a Russian infiltration problem in the campaign, which is mind-boggling. But the other thing that I don't think enough people have taken notice of is the CIA director, John Brennan, braced his Russian counterpart in October of 2016, said, "We know what you're up to, stop." And then we're told a couple of weeks later that Obama took it up with Putin himself, telling him, again, "We know what you're up to, knock it off." So in what universe is it sensible that you're worried about Russian infiltration, you tip off the Russians, but you won't tell Trump? I mean, how crazy is that? So I think it's mind-boggling in many ways, but just those two things I think ought to leave people shaking their heads for a long time.
Two quick follow-ups here, Andy. You're very generous with your time, as always. First of all, it's very rare from what we've seen from him in the past, but to have John Durham come out with a statement saying, there's more to this story, I don't agree with all these conclusions, and Attorney General Barr essentially saying the same thing. You've worked in this environment before in a U.S. Attorney's office. How rare is that, and what does that tell you?
Well, it's not as rare for the Attorney General to come out and make a statement, because I think, Greg, on a day as momentous as yesterday, you would have expected the Attorney General would make a statement anyhow. And he did, and in fact began making statements, I think, about a week ago when his spokesperson issued a statement saying that Horowitz's work, the IG's work, was a great credit to the department. So I wasn't so surprised to see Barr make a statement, and Barr is a very strong, confident, opinionated fellow. So when he makes a statement, it doesn't surprise me that he was right to the point, and in a very unvarnished way made it known what he thought about what the Inspector General had found, particularly with respect to the FISA abuse. And I think with respect to Durham, he's a guy who's not known for making statements. His reputation is exactly the opposite. But I think he may have felt like his hand was forced, not that he directly reacted to the press, but there was an article in I think it was the Washington Post, that indicated that he was all in on Horowitz's conclusions. And I think he realized that his investigation was therefore being used by the Democrats and their media note takers to try to roll out a narrative that Horowitz's report was an exoneration of the FBI, and he didn't want to be used that way, and I don't blame him for that.
Andy, last point. One of the things that Horowitz also said in the IG report is if the FBI could be this sloppy, make this many mistakes on a case of this significance, where we're talking about the presidential campaign of a presidential nominee of a major party, what does that mean in terms of how the FBI treats regular Americans, for lack of a better term? How concerned should we be about that?
Well, we should be concerned. The essential point is right. If the procedures and the people carrying them out are so lax that they could do something abusive in connection with somebody who was very prominent in a case that was obviously important, you would have to worry about how they would treat the ordinary person. My one comeback to that, to give us a little bit of a comfort level, is I think the problem here, Greg, is more national security, counterintelligence, surveillance than the criminal justice system generally. And what I mean by that is, in the criminal system, like when I was a prosecutor, I could go to the court to get a warrant, and I could go in secret. But I went with the assumption, and everybody in the equation had the assumption, that eventually I was going to indict people, and therefore there was going to be a full-blown public trial, and there was going to be discovery, and all my representations to the court would become public and would become known to the defense lawyers. And that has a way, I think, of keeping people honest, whereas the problem with counterintelligence is it's all classified. It's really only done to collect information. There's never a public trial, or rarely is that information used in a public trial. And people do not act with the assumption that anyone is ever going to check their work. In fact, the opposite assumption applies. Everybody thinks what they're doing is classified and will never see the light of day. And lo and behold, what do we find? When human beings don't think anyone's checking their work, they take liberties. And what I'd be very concerned about is the FISA aspect of the FBI's work, which is not – it's very important. It's not, though, the broadest work the FBI does is criminal law enforcement. And this doesn't trouble me. This investigation doesn't trouble me so much about criminal law enforcement, but it does make me wonder what on earth are they doing on the FISA front.
Andy, a lot of great info there. Thank you very much for your time and your expertise, as always.
Thank you, Greg.
Andrew C. McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. The book is Ball of Collusion. I highly recommend it. He's also a Fox News contributor and a contributing editor and columnist at National Review. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.